So I'll talk a little bit about OSF for project coordination. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between OSF and maybe some of the other data repositories that you might leverage to actually deposit your final data sets in. And if we have time, we'll talk really briefly about licenses and how they relate back to data. So OSF really, this is one of the ways that I like to talk about it is as a project coordination tool. Sometimes I say project management is really not about project management. It's not about task assignment. It's not about coordinating dates. It's really about thinking about the fact that we use a lot of multifaceted systems when we are involved in a project, especially when we start to look at the scope of working through research data management and all the different pieces involved. And thinking about some of those pieces which have already been articulated is this notion of people, this notion of objects, which is like the data and the intermediary files that go in there. And then all that metadata and that really kind of those comments about whether or not the interns are going to have time to finish. This is when this notion of metadata, not just being about the data itself, but metadata about the project becomes so crucial in terms of that pass off to bringing in others to work on it, and where I think a platform like OSF really excels. So when we're talking about people, when we're talking about objects, when we're talking about metadata, we're talking about permissions. Not everybody needs access to every aspect of a project. This is particularly true when we're thinking about who outside of the immediate need of the project might need to see aspects of it. We're also talking about, during the process of development, all these intermediary products and this notion of version control. As was mentioned in previous ones, we're talking about deposit, we're talking about the potential for publication as data papers or presentations, that dissemination piece, and then ultimately this whole kind of like everything wrapped up in documentation, so that everything which is really this idea of we are so full of tacit knowledge and trying to take that tacit knowledge and actually put it down into documentation so that others know how to integrate themselves with the project, and then that piece of licensing for how others know how to use the products that we produce as part of the data rescue project. So where does OSF really fit in here? So what OSF does is kind of like if we think about all these aspects, we can think about them mapping to a directory structure. And OSF will take this directory structure and move it into a cloud-based environment. And I'll show you what that looks like as we look at a demo shortly. And it's a hub for otherwise disconnected services. So when we think about, we'll look at what some of these disconnected services are in, I think, like in the next slide. But when we think about the platforms that we use to author, whether that's Microsoft Word in 365, whether that's using like Google Docs, the places where we store information, again, whether it's things like OneDrive or Google, they have no way of actually talking to each other generally. And I think one of the really big things here is that OSF is an opportunity in terms of how it structures its metadata and how it structures its file organizations is really an opportunity to build a narrative and to tell a story. This has purposes within and without the project. I think in terms of within the project, it is that opportunity to think in advance, and really that exercise that you were just working on, this notion of thinking in advance about how this project is going to unfold, what needs to happen, and how do I articulate that? And how do I articulate that as a wrapper around the work which is actually going to happen, as opposed to as a document that sits on my desktop and that only I have access to. And anytime somebody new comes to the project, I have to send them an email with that document attachment. And that notion of onboarding, offboarding becomes really awkward. But it also kind of fits in with, like, if we're looking for funding for this, or if we're looking to connect the work that we're doing to the larger living data project which is happening, or the other data rescue projects which are happening, OSF gives us really discrete ways to do that. So when we think, again, a lot of this we've gone over, when we think about that directory structure, we're thinking about where do we document things, where do we store the background? So where do we, if there's relevant literature that the interns are bringing up, if they're establishing that protocol, okay, so how are we going to approach this? What is going to be the methodology? Working through the actual data itself. And so there's going to be stuff which is in process. There's going to be stuff which is ready for review. There's going to be potentially, depending on what you're working with, there's going to be these issues of privacy and security, especially if we're working with like red listed species. And then there's going to be all of these outputs associated with that. And just kind of touching on those disconnected surfaces again, we're going to author things, we're going to store things, we might have citations, all these different platforms, they all live distinct from one another. How do we actually communicate this in a single place? And OSF is one example of, well, actually, you know what? OSF is, as far as I know, is the only platform that doesn't try to take over the individual capacities of each one of those other platforms, really just connects everything together in one spot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually pop the link into the chat box for this project page and I encourage you to bring it up because what you see is going to be a little bit different from what I see, simply because of how I've structured the permissions for how we have access to this. And I think it is maybe helpful in thinking about some of that exposure. And so some of the things that you won't see when we look at this is I've got administration and data lockdown. So the idea here being that if I'm putting together a project and I want it to kind of mirror the workflow of the activities I need to take on, and this is just a really rough demo I threw together. But we can assume that as part of a project, we're going to have administrative tasks. We're going to have that kind of that background section. I believe that Joey touched on that about like, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of the project? Where did the data come from? What is the narrative that surrounds that? We're going to have the data itself. And again, that data is going to be in a series of iterative kind of stages of development, right? Especially if we're looking at either developing scripts to be able to pull stuff out of databases or looking at transferring from paper to digital. It's not just going to be said and done. There's going to be iterative processes, and there might be a quality review stage at some point. And then there's going to be this idea of we're going to put it somewhere where when we think about that accessibility, that reusability, we want it to sit somewhere where people are going to be able to find it and where it's going to be described with the relevant metadata for them to do that. The interns yourselves may have some interest in doing either a presentation out of this or a data paper. So we may want someplace to store that relevant stuff. And then we may want to connect ourselves to other projects. And so this is the larger living data project that folks are working on. And I've linked that back in to this project, this kind of mock project, which is about amphibian conservancy data rescue. And so part of what we get with OSF is we get this, we get a landing space like this. We get a landing space that allows us to add people to our project. Sorry, the highlighting's not great there. It provides us with a set of metadata that we don't need to worry about tracking on our own. So it lets us know kind of when things were started and when things were changed. The other thing, if we scroll down the page here a little bit, is it lets us know in terms of that when things were changed, it actually gives us a bit of an iterative, it gives us a more detailed history as to what's happened. So somebody's supervising a project. One of the things you can do is you can pop in here really quickly and you can look to see what the activity is that has taken place in the last little bit. So it really kind of, it helps with that communication piece. It helps with that transparency piece in terms of how we engage in those relationships when we work on these projects. If we scroll back up to the top, it provides us the opportunity to provide a really brief description of what it is that we're working on. And it gives us the opportunity to provide a pre-canned license for how we want people to reuse our data. And we'll talk a little bit more about licenses in a little bit. So one of the things that when we think about these disconnected services and bringing these together and being able to tell that narrative, the other piece that we get is we get this wiki on the landing page. And if we go in there and we look at what we can do with this wiki, this is an opportunity for us to be able to talk about who the relevant contact points are, provide a bit of context for how people are expected to engage with the project, who the relevant contact points are. It allows us to talk about the site structure. And even though you may not be able to see every single one of these components, from the context of transparency and being able to communicate the nature of the work, you can let people know that this stuff exists. And if they should have access and they don't have access, they know exactly where they should be going in order to do this. I'm going to pop out of here quickly, and I'm going to do this really quickly, just as kind of like this is in the spirit of knowing that we're short on time, but also knowing that the interns are going to be somewhat familiar with this, but also there are opportunities. I think if people want a more in-depth review of something like OSF, that is definitely something that we can that we can help to support. And so this is like, if I'm going to do a pitch for OSF, my pitch is one URL, and you get all this information right there, and you can pass off this information to whomever else is working on the project with you. And it is a great way to think about what is the structure of my project, what am I going to be putting together, what am I going to be disseminating, and how am I going to disseminate that, and it encourages us to think about that in advance. And then it allows us to start to piece in where am I going to store this information. So what I've done is I've just got a couple of demos to walk us through how we can connect to other services. If we pop into the administration panel, which you will not be able to see because I've restricted that access. If we pop into administration, you can see that one of the things that I've done is I've linked in my Google Drive account. And so if we wanted to do hours tracking for our students and maybe have some administrative documentation that only project partners were able to see, and I happen to use Google Drive in order to do that, that can sit within here. And when we go to open up a document like this in OSF, OSF does not take control of this information. OSF will render what is sitting in the attached drives. And so it'll render a Google Doc as a PDF to sit in there. If somebody wants to go in and edit this, if I clicked on view this file in Google Drive, it would only allow me to edit that file if I was authenticated to have access to that file in Google Drive. So it really does work as a portal. All it does is it opens a door between these services. It allows the information to be fed in to be able to be opened. But if you actually want to engage in editing, you move back to the parent platform that has control over those documents. The same would be working with like a Google Sheet. It will be rendered in place as a static object within OSF. And if somebody needs to be able to edit it, they get moved into the Google Drive, and Google Drive controls all the permissions and all the sharing. I'm going to pop out of administration for a moment. The other thing which might be worth looking at some point is if we are looking at what I have here, if we're doing deposits, we can manage these in multiple ways. You can see that one of the things I've done here is I've just utilized the wiki to let people know that I've put a deposit in 2 different locations. I provided the DOI for those people to access those data deposits, and then you can include within the wiki, you can include any metadata that you want to. So we can use the wiki to send people out. The other option that we have is to be able to redirect individuals. So for example, if we go into our data platform, so let's say that we have data which is currently in process and for review. I think if what I was going to do, so actually I will come back to that shortly because that was another feature that I wanted to highlight. I think it's in publications actually, that if we go into publications, we can link out directly. So if we have a publication that comes to this, again, from a single landing point, we can let people know that we have publications. When you actually click on that component, we can redirect it, and we could redirect it directly out to that publication. So any URL that we want to connect to, we can connect that URL back in here. I think I chose something which is not open access, which is my bad, or UBC system is just kind of overriding there. But you can see that it will lead us into the other web page. And so again, it provides that portal of access into other systems. We'll just let Wiley load so that we can see that that is actually there. And so one of the things that we can also then do with that is it's not just about linking into publications. We can link into the data repositories where we actually put stuff. So if we come back up a level and we go into something like our deposits, I'm pretty sure that I thought I'd put one in there that actually linked back out, but that's okay. That's not a big deal. What I do want to do is I was going to go into data. So this is one of the other ones, which is really nice. So let's say that you as the supervisor, your intern is working through some stuff that is in process. Once they think that it's at a stage which is ready for review, they transfer it from the component for process into the component for review. And what you can do is you can set up your settings in any single one of these to be able to get email notifications. So as soon as your intern pops something in there, you'll get an email that says something's been added to the review folder, which is nice in terms of being able to do that communication, follow up back and forth without everybody always needing to send a little note and unnecessarily inundating our inboxes with some of the small pieces of communication. Okay, so that's kind of like it. What I like to really demo with this is that you can get a single landing location. You can take advantage of all the other services that you're using. You can link back out to, I have one of these components that links back out to our institutional OneDrive at UBC. So there's a lot of stuff that we can't do at UBC using Google Drive and Dropbox. So we have our institutional OneDrive. I can't integrate it right in, but in the same way that I can link out to a publication, I can link out to the OneDrive folder. And so again, it allows everything to be housed in one single spot. I can also, when we look at like things being locked down here, when we think about adding team members to these projects, if I wanted to come in and I wanted to add, if I wanted to add Joey to this, I can find Joey in here. I get to choose whether or not he has read permission, so he can just look at the material, if he can edit the material, or if he can administrate, and that is, he can make things public, he can change permissions and stuff like that. So I might add Joey as an intern, if that was his role, with just read-write permissions. And then we get to pick the individual components that we want to add Joey to. So what should Joey have access to? And we can easily add and remove him from any single one of these. And that adds and removes him from all of the connections, all the add-ons that we have in each one of those individual components. Okay, I think that's kind of the key point of where something like this really shines. I think for working in a project that has the capacity to unravel into using a bunch of different services, that has the potential to have a number of interns or students come and go, and we need to manage those permissions. And being able to have a single URL, a single location that we know that we can go to in order to access everything that we need, and in which we can provide a bit of a narrative to allow individuals to interpret the project that we're doing, and to allow individuals who are being onboarded a single location to get a scope of what's happening, even though we're using a bunch of disconnected services. So that's the sample page. I think when we think about like this notion of why would we not just house everything in OSF, why would we put our data somewhere else in one of the repositories that Mike is going to talk about? And this is really about metadata. And it really comes down to the fact that OSF is a generic repository. You can put anything you want in OSF. It doesn't need to be data. It can be textual. It can be images. When we think about data repositories, even a generic data repository is very specific. When we think about that, we have specific repositories for hosting journals, specific repositories for hosting images. We have specific repositories for hosting data. And they provide a level of service. They provide a level of description that when we think about access reusability supersedes what we'll get out of OSF. So what OSF does really well is it brings things together in one tool. It allows us to tell that story. Data repositories, when we think about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data, that is what data repositories enable. And that's why we would move stuff out. When we think about licensing is hugely complex. I think if we come back to one of the issues, and so without getting into the details of any individual licenses, one of the things that we run into when we have a project like this is, am I licensing the narrative content that I've included here? Am I licensing the data, or am I licensing any scripts that an intern has uploaded in order to process that data? Licensing is hugely complicated, and all I really want to say is we should think very carefully about what it is that we're licensing, how we've described that, and who actually has ownership over that data product in order to be able to provide that license. And I think this is the interns are going to come with training in this, so this will be part of that discussion. There will be support from the mentors in terms of how do we navigate this? But this is also why it's nice to have in OSF, it's nice to have a data connection that is private, because if you don't yet know who the copyright holder is, but you want to start working on it, you can keep it behind the scenes and not open to the public. And then add a specific license once you're ready to deposit it into a repository. And so it really is this thing that we will use different licenses depending on whether or not we are talking about the authored documents, whether or not we're talking about the code, or whether or not we're talking about the data. I think I will leave it there. The one other thing, so Mike is going to talk about Creative Commons licensing, I think, and a couple of other options. The one thing I think is worth disambiguating here for people who are not super familiar with navigating things like copyright and licensing is that basically we have two categories that we can choose from. We can choose from bespoke, which is we have a custom license, and we can go with something which is pre-canned, like Creative Commons, or for those of you familiar with software, working with like GNU or open source licenses. With bespoke, if somebody wants to use your product, if they want to use your data, they need to read through the license and understand what the license is dictating. When they use something which is pre-canned, like something like Creative Commons, that Creative Commons is pre-articulated. It's got a legal contract sitting behind it. It's got a human readable interpretation sitting in front of it. And it's machine readable. So when you apply a license in something like OSF or in any of the repositories that Mike is going to introduce you to, the metadata sits in there so that basically an application like Google is able to query and understand that license, and then feed that license back out to people who are looking for data sets that they're able to reuse in specific ways.